In the early 20th century, racism was not simply policy, it was also pop culture. In 1918's Tarzan of the Apes, Africa, a continent populated by black people, was a land that could only be tamed by white men. In 1931, the comic series Tintin in the Congo portrayed the Congolese as lazy, stupid, or in awe of Tintin, which could be blamed on Joseph Conrad's Art of Darkness. Published in 1899, Art of Darkness was a three-part magazine serial that tells the story of a steamboat captain navigating a primitive Africa and the brutalities of Belgian colonialism, and is also full of African stereotypes that should not only be disregarded in today's society but probably forgotten altogether. Yet, in 2017, Maya Jasonov, a Harvard University history professor, released an article in the New York Times about a trip to Africa, signifying clearly that African nations still have a long way to go before escaping the stereotypes and bad representation. But then, something incredible happened in February 2018 when the revolutionary Marvel Studio epic superhero movie was released and changed everything. But before Black Panther took a massive step forward for accurate and respectful African representation, it took a long time for Hollywood to finally get it right.
Look, Will, you are entitled to your opinions, but the best movie ever made was not Cleopatra Jones. It was Casablanca.
Oh, please. Here you have a movie set in Africa. There's only one brother in the whole thing, and he from Detroit.
In the early days of cinema, African American representation was either non-existent or straight up insulting. It wasn't until movies like Star Wars with Lando Calrissian that an African American was featured in a big Hollywood movie in a somewhat dignifying role. So expecting real and true African representation was a bit of a stretch. The need for representation comes from the importance of watching characters that look like you. But representation doesn't only mean putting some people of color in a movie and call it a day. It's about the correct depiction of a culture and a commentary of a specific racist issue in a way that is respectful and relatable. That's why I cannot really count the 1964 movie Zulu as an accurate depiction of a culture or an historical event, because the movie is clearly only interested in one camp's perspective and doesn't dive deeper in the conflict that causes the confrontation, because that would mean vilifying the white British man, and that was a big no-no. I'll give the movie some credit for showing some respect to the South African warriors, which was revolutionary in the 60s, I assume. In a time when most African countries were colonized by Europeans, the movie had no interest in criticizing the British colonial expansion in the 19th century, so it treated the battle as an heroic defeat conceded by the British soldiers, and that's kind of messed up. But it was the 60s, and it could have been much worse. After the 60s era, most African countries freed themselves from the colonialism and started building their own legacy through democracy. But unfortunately, while it was no longer cool to portray the white colonizer as the good guy, Hollywood found another way to incorporate African stereotypes in the movies. And I believe the most stereotypical movie ever made is probably Coming to America. The movie is quite funny and Eddie Murphy is literally the funniest man on the planet. But it does not surprise me that a movie directed by a white dude and also written by mostly white people who have probably never set foot in an African country get absolutely everything wrong about the continent. I mean, the king of an African nation is literally named Geoffrey Joffer. Like, were these people even trying? They didn't even bother researching actual African names? The fictional country of Zamunda was probably a way for them to distance themselves from an accurate depiction of African culture, but they might as well make up a fictional continent at this point. The fact that Zamunda is a kingdom instead of a democratic country, even though Akim's father, played by James Earl Jones, was inspired by Zaire's president Joseph Mobutu, tells you everything you need to know about the movie. They literally have the royal palace in the middle of a goddamn jungle, for Christ's sake. The fact that the main protagonist thinks the only way he can find an intelligent woman who he can fall in love with is to go to America, and the depiction of African women to prove that point makes it a lot more insulting. They literally have animals walking around in the royal palace. Like, I believe this movie is probably the reason so many people at some point seem to think wild animals in Africa just walk around freely, when the reality is, just like in any other country in the world, if you don't go to the zoo, you'll never see a wild animal anywhere. I've only seen 2 wild animals in my life, a gorilla and a tiger, and that was in a zoo in Kinshasa about 12 years ago. The movie tries to make fun of stereotypes, but it doesn't work, because while criticizing offensive stereotypes, it contributes to the misconception Americans have of the continent of Africa. The movie also doesn't feature any sort of African language, and the only African song featured in Coming to America is Lady Smith Black Mabanzo's Mbube, which will inspire the Lion King's The Lion Sleeps Tonight song. Speaking of, The Lion King is also another American movie written and directed by white people with a mostly white cast, but unlike Coming to America, it actually features African culture, both in the score and in the story itself. For example, the name Simba means lion in Swahili, or the famous slang Hakuna Matata, which roughly translates to no worries and is a combination of 2 Swahili words, Hakuna meaning nothing or no, and Matata meaning problems or issues or tough. The word was first used in the song Jambo Bwana by Them Mushrooms, but was popularized by Disney's Lion King, and is one of the main reasons The Lion King is this popular in Africa compared to most Disney animated movies. Because Swahili is probably the most spoken language across the continent, and incorporating it in the movie helps Africans resonate with the content. It seems like a small detail, but when talking lions represent African culture better than a live-action film about an African prince, then you must have f***ed up somewhere. To understand how progressive a movie like Lion King was, you have to look at 1999's Tarzan, a movie that I assume takes place in Congo, but doesn't feature a single black character, African music, or anything that indicates where the story takes place. All we hear are a bunch of Phil Collins songs, which renders the movie soulless, because if it doesn't take place in Europe but only features European music and an American-inspired score, then the movie ends up having no identity, because at the end it represents nothing. I love Tarzan, but it kind of just exists and refuses to be anything else. That's probably why barely anyone remembers it. Say anything you want about the 2016 Tarzan, but at least it's got Margot Robbie speaking Lingala.
Shut your mouth!
I used to think it was all about who writes these stories, that maybe more African writers are needed. But then in 1998, Kirikou and the Sorceress came out, an animated movie written and directed by Michel Ocelot, a white man, taking place somewhere in Africa in an ancient and rural society, a fairy tale about a wonder kid trying to protect his village from a terrifying sorceress. If you haven't, you should definitely check it out.
The Black Panther, our first black superhero. And boy, I think he's going to be a big hit. At least I hope so. I got my fingers crossed.
After the 90s era, things got a bit worse for African representation on film, as the movies portrayed the continent as a mysterious and dangerous isolated land, with only limited ties to modern civilization. African representation went through a phase I like to call the African terrorist cliché phase. Around that time, Hollywood reduced Africa to a faraway land filled with wild animals, wars, poverty, and AIDS. And to save them all is the white man who knows everything. The saddest part is that there are actually movies that portray African culture more positively, with far more accuracy, but they are mostly ignored by mainstream audiences because of their niche nature. Africa in the late 60s and early 70s was filled with post-independence optimism, but the international image of the continent was one of a continent that still needed paternalistic guidance in the form of neo-colonialist policies. It was hardly a place of innovation and technology, and yet Stan Lee and Jack Kirby saw the potential of Afrofuturism. It's impossible to praise the movie's achievement without acknowledging Black Panther comics. The character first appeared in 1966 in Fantastic Four number 52 and was automatically associated with the Black Panther movement later. The comics had to change his name briefly to Black Leopard to distance the character from the controversy, before reverting it back to Black Panther on the reader's request. But the most interesting aspect of the character is that he was never a victim of some sort. His nation is powerful and is the rightful heir to the throne of the fictional kingdom of Wakanda. T'Challa is already one of the African elite, an educated prince who lives between Africa and the West. His scientifically advanced kingdom outpaces the space race on the way at the time, specifically because it is able to control its own natural resources. The revolutionary thing about Black Panther is that it envisions a world not devoid of racism, but one in which black people have the wealth, technology and military might to level the playing field. A scenario applicable not only to the predominantly white landscape of Hollywood, but more important to the world at large. And this is where the movie comes in play. Chadwick Boseman, upon the release of the film, declared in an interview, "You might say that this African nation is fantasy, but to have the opportunity to pull from real ideas, real places, and real African concepts and put it inside of this idea of Wakanda, that's a great opportunity to develop a sense of what that identity is, especially when you are disconnected from it." February 2018, Johannesburg. It's the premiere of Black Panther. Everyone in the theater is dressed in traditional outfits. We got graced by the presence of Danai Gurira and Lupita Nyong'o, who traveled all the way from the US to share this moment with South African fans. They went on to visit many other African countries to promote the movie, which to my knowledge has never been done before for a movie of this size. It signifies the respect these actors have for the culture they are representing. Some of these actors like Lupita and Danai being of African descent actually helps as well. I'll never forget my experience watching this movie in a packed theater that went nuts after seeing South African actors appear on screen. I will even find out later that T'Chaka's younger version and his older version are played by two South African actors who happen to be father and son. How freaking amazing is that? I will never forget the reaction of the crowd hearing this song. I will never forget the reaction of the crowd hearing Danai Gurira and Chadwick Boseman speak Xhosa, or Mbakudu, a Nigerian accent. A lot of people talk about how this movie changed the game for African Americans in Hollywood, but to me, it changed the game for African representation as well. Movies like Coming to America won't be tolerated in a post-Black Panther era, and that is a huge step forward.
How do you think your ancestors got these? You think they paid a fair price? Or did they take it like they took everything else?
The movie is not surface level either. I know I've been a lot more critical of Black Panther than I am with most movies, but I actually respect the hell out of this movie. A character like Killmonger must have been very tricky for them to do, because while T'Challa is a conservative who only looks after his people's interests, Killmonger represents a different perspective, the American who has suffered from growing up too far from home and lost his way, let himself consumed by hatred. I kind of wish they didn't make Killmonger kill his own people just to make the crowd root for T'Challa, because Killmonger in some ways is the hero of the story. If they didn't make him kill the Dora Milaje for no reason and have him try to kill Shuri, he would have stolen the story away from T'Challa in his own movie. Because while Wakanda represents an African country untouched by the poison of the West and self-empowerment of an African nation, it also doesn't look good on them that they didn't even consider helping the other countries in the continent who are actually suffering. So the people of Wakanda are a bunch of hypocrites, and Killmonger was right. And that's very compelling, even though I thought they could have done a bit more with that. Since it's a Marvel movie, the priority was put on action and spectacle, and as a result, Africa in the movie doesn't feel like the big continent it is, and they never explore Wakanda's place in the continent. It was just about making the movie as Hollywood as possible, and that makes perfect sense business-wise, so I will not hold that against the movie. You could say that Black Panther kind of still contains some of those African stereotypes. For example, people fight with spears and swords for the throne, something that hasn't happened in any African society in centuries. If they are as developed as they claim to be, why are they not applying a more modern system that doesn't involve fighting each other like animals? One thing I'll give the movie credit for is how it took the African terrorist cliché we have seen in previous movies like Blood Diamond, but this time it's not some white guy who stops the terrorists. It's a black superhero. That's pretty fucking cool. I really felt angry when I saw Will Smith's interpretation of Muhammad Ali chill on the beach during a scene that was supposed to be taking place in Kinshasa, because it looked nothing like Kinshasa. I know they had trouble getting a permit to shoot in Kinshasa and had to shoot those scenes in Mozambique, so I won't blame it on the filmmakers. But Ali vs Foreman is the greatest event in Congo's history, and seeing it in live action with Muhammad Ali being played by Will Smith would have been pretty epic. I know Black Panther wasn't shot in Africa either, but that doesn't matter since Wakanda is not a real country. What I wanted to see was a respect for the African traditions and a superhero of African descent that actually felt like an African. And the fact that a movie made by Americans, mostly for Americans, about a character created by white Americans and produced by an American studio managed to actually put it off is to me some sort of miracle. Black Panther is obviously not perfect, but its respect for the story it's telling is something to acknowledge and applaud. The makers of Black Panther seem determined to get things right, drawing on research trips to Africa, historical resources, and specific cultural references. It wasn't done before, and no one thought it would ever be done, yet it happened, and that is the reason why Black Panther will forever be iconic.
Yango munyango to sara bozwaga boza pena oyo no omoni bino bana bazanga mayele ngangilele 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 ngango yango yo malobo suki yango yo yango ya koroba o yango